Good Holy Mom, and in today's video, I will talk about the origin of music. In all probability, music has played an important role in the life scale of humans perhaps. Even before we could speak, significant evidence has been discovered that Berryman developed primitive flutes from animal bones and used stones and wood as percussion. Voice would have been the first and most natural means of expression in our distant ancestors, used to bond socially or comfort a sleepless child. It is from these humble beginnings that the music we enjoy today evolved. As we move further through the history of music, we find increasing evidence of its key role in sacred and secular settings. Although the division into these categories was not defined in this way until many years later. Origin of music. Influences from the west to the east merged into the pre-Christian music of the Greeks and later the Romans. Musical practices and conventions, perhaps conveyed by traveling musicians, brought a wealth of diversity and invention. Surviving Greek notations from this period of musical history has given scientists and musicologists alike a vital clue to the way that the music of the time might have sounded. It certainly indicates remarkable links to the music that would follow, perhaps most notably through the use of modality in Greek music. Christianity had established itself, and with it came a new liturgy that demanded a new music. Although early Christian music had its roots in the practices and beliefs of the Hebrew people, what emerged from this was to become the basis for sacred music for centuries to come. The chants that were composed devoutly followed the sacred Latin text in a fashion that was tightly controlled and given only to the glory of God. Music was very subservient to the words, without flurries of frivolity. Medieval period. As we move forward in musical time, we begin to enter the medieval period of music, which can be generally agreed to span the period from around 500 AD up until the mid 15th century. By this time, music was a dominant art in taverns to cathedrals, practiced by kings to paupers alike. It was during this extended period of music that the sound of music becomes increasingly familiar. This is partly due to the development of musical notations, much of which has survived, that allows us a window back into this fascis- fascinating time. From the written music that survives from the monasteries and other important accounts of musical practices, it's possible to assemble an image of a vibrant culture that ranges from the sacred to all secular. Throughout the medieval period, the music slowly began to adopt even more elaborate structures and devices that produce works of immense beauty and devotion. Hildegard von Bingen and Perotin pioneered many of the musical forms we still recognize today, including the motet and the sacred mass. Alongside these important forms came the madrigal that often reflects the moods and feelings of the people. Renaissance period. Instruments developed in accordance with the composer's imaginations. A full count of wind, brass, and percussion instruments accompanied the medieval music, although it is still the human voice that dominates many of the compositions. Towards the close of the high medieval period, we find the emergence of instrumental pieces in their own right, which in turn paves the way for many musical forms in the following period, the Renaissance. Before leaving this period of music, it is important to mention the troubadours and the trovers. These traveling storytellers and musicians covered vast distance on their journey across Europe and further afield into Asia. They told stories, sang ballads, and perhaps most importantly, brought with them influences from far and wide, seamlessly blended with the Western musical cultures. Baroque period. The Baroque period 1600-1760 houses some of the most famous composers and pieces that we have in Western classical music. It also sees some of the most important musical and instrumental developments. Italy, Germany, England, and France continue from the Renaissance to dominate the musical landscape, each influencing the other conventions and style. Amongst the many celebrated composers of the time, G.F. Handel, Bach, Vivaldi, and Purcell provide a substantial introduction to the music of this era. It is during this glittering span of time that Handel composes his oratorio, the Misha. Vivaldi, the Four Seasons, Bach, his six Brandenburg concertos, and the 48 free, preludes and fugues, together with Purcell Opera Dido and Aeneas. Instrumental music was composed and performed in tandem with vocal works, each of equal importance in the Baroque. The virtuosity that began amongst the elite Renaissance performers flourished in the Baroque. Consider the keyboard sonatas of Domenico Scarlatti or the concertos that Vivaldi composed for his student performers. This in turn leads to significant instrumental developments, and thanks to the aristocratic support of Catherine Medici, the birth of the violin. Common musical forms were established, founded on the Renaissance composers' principles, but extended and developed in ways that they would have probably found unimaginable. The suite became a Baroque favorite, comprising contrasting fast slow movements like the prelude, Allemande, the gig,
Gigi, Coranti, and the Sarabande. Concertos became ever more popular, giving instrumentalists the opportunity to display their technical and expressive powers. Classical period. From the Baroque, we step in the classical period 1730-1820. Here, Haydn and Mozart dominate the musical landscape in Germany and Australia. Austria sit at the creative heart of the period. From the ornate Baroque composers of the classical period move away from the polyphonic towards the homophonic writings music that was on the surface of it at least simple, sleek, and measured. One key development is that of the piano. The Baroque harpsichord is replaced by the early piano, which was a more reliable and expressive instrument. Mozart and Haydn each wrote a large numbers of works for the piano which allowed for this instrument to develop significantly during this period. Chamber music alongside orchestral music was featured of the classical era with particular attention towards the string quartet. The orchestra itself was firmly established and towards the later of the period began to include clarinets, trombones, and timpani. The rise of the virtuous performer continued throughout this period of music as demonstrated by the many of the concertos and sonatas composed during this time. Romantic period. As the classical era closed, Beethoven is the most notable composer who made such a huge contribution to the change into the Romantic 1780-1880. Beethoven's immense genius shaped the next few decades with his substantial redefining of many of the established musical conventions of the classical era. His work of sonata form in his concertos, symphonies, string quartets, and sonatas goes almost unmatched by any other composer. The Romantic era saw huge developments in the quality and range of many instruments that naturally encouraged even more expressive and diverse music from the composers. Musical forms like the Romantic orchestra became expansive landscapes where composers gave full and unbridled rein to their deepest emotion and dreams. Verdi in his Symphony Fantastique is a fine example of this, or later Wagner in his immense operas. The symphonies of Gustav Mahler stand like stone pillars of achievement at the end of the Romantic period alongside the poems of Richard Strauss. The Romantic period presents us with a vast array of rich music that only towards the end of the 19th century began to fade.